I hope you can see my first slide, because we're here to have an evening of celebrating our swifts, these wonderful birds that spend their life in the sky. Now, my previous problem was not being able to advance my slides, so I hope you've all got your fingers crossed. Let's remind ourselves about these wonderful birds. Their characteristic is that they form these screaming parties as they hurtle around the rooftops of our towns and villages. It's a real herald of summer when they arrive at the beginning of May. Now, this is actually a fantastic time to be talking about swifts, because it's actually the National Swift Awareness Week, which is the 3rd to the 11th of July this year. Now, obviously, because of circumstances, last year and this year, it's been a bit difficult to plan events. So I've got some pictures up here of what we did 3 years ago, which is when we first started this Swift Awareness Week, which is to draw attention of everybody to these wonderful birds with this extraordinary lifestyle, and yet to talk about their plight and the threats they face, and so what we can do about it. So in Sedbergh, we had the shops decorated with bunting and displays, as you can see, and the craft workshop made all sorts of beautiful things in glass and silver. And we had a display in the church, and I gave a talk, which followed by a little walk, and we had refreshments, and a local confectioner made Swift biscuits for us to enjoy after the refreshments, and very good they were too. So, a little bit about swifts. There's only one swift that comes to the UK, that's the common swift. It's only here for 3 months, arrives in early May, and they've gone by August. And the incredible thing about swifts is that they eat on the wing, they drink on the wing, they mate on the wing, and they even sleep on the wing. And in fact, the only time that the swift lands is for that 3 months when it's here, when it's breeding. The other 9 months of the year, it is entirely airborne, it doesn't land. And even more incredibly, the young, the chicks, once they fledge from the nest, they're not going to land until they themselves are old enough to breed, which can be anything from 2 to 4 years' time. They can fly up to 70 miles an hour. They can cover 1,000 kilometers a day. They can go up to 3,000 meters in height. So you can see that they're an extremely versatile bird, looking for the insects on which they feed. Now, swifts have got very tiny legs. In fact, the name apus apus means footless. Now, they have got feet and in very sharp claws, but the legs are very tiny. They can only shuffle about when they're actually in the nest, and that means they can't perch. And that means that if they should be grounded for any reason, it's very hard for them to take off. Indeed, it can actually be fatal. So what do you do if you find a grounded swift? And we do get contacted all the time for advice about what happens. So the first thing is to put it on the palm of your hand, go to an open place near where you find it, and let it take off in its own time. Don't throw it in the air. Hopefully it will take off and then go and fly. This is what we hope will happen. And if it doesn't take off, then maybe keep it for a while in something like a shoebox, in the dark, possibly a drink with a little dampened cotton bud. And if it still won't fly after that, then it's going to need some help. Now, common swift has a very wide summer distribution. This is the red. Western extremity in Ireland, through Europe, Scandinavia, the Middle East, right over to the Far East and China. Extremely wide distribution. And the blue is actually the winter distribution. But although we guessed that's what it was, we didn't really know exactly where and what route the swifts took. And this is how we found out. And this is only actually just over a decade ago that this work was done. And basically, swifts were fitted with a tiny device called a geolocator. You can just see it there. The swift was harnessed with this. Here you can see it with the feathers parted. And it doesn't do the swift any harm. It's a very tiny device. And this device will record everywhere that the swift has been during the 9 months that it's not with us. Here you can see the route it takes. This was a swift that was tagged in Cambridge, and this is the route they take through Western Africa. And we discovered or confirmed our suspicions that the main wintering area is here, this yellow area here in the Congo. That's the main wintering area. They move a little further east, usually towards Mozambique, but this is the wintering area. And what I'm going to show you now is the spring migration, the return of this bird back to Cambridge. So on the 19th of April, it was on the coast of Equatorial Guinea. A day later, it was over the skies of Liberia. And as you can see from those dates, about 10 days or so, it was lingering in the skies of Liberia. And in fact, we now know that all European swifts do this. And the reason is it coincides with the eruption of termite nests. So they're able to get really a good feed ready for the rest of their journey. So this bird left Liberia on the 4th of May, 8th of May, 10th of May. 6 days later, it was back in its nest site in Cambridge. That's 6 days to accomplish a journey of 5,500 kilometres. A swift weighs only 40 grams. That's like a Cadbury's cream egg. So it really is a remarkable migration. And what we did for Swift Awareness Week, we decided with the children of the primary school in Sedbergh to have a big map of Africa as a display. And we gave them the flags of African countries, all the African countries that the swifts flew through on their migration. So it was actually a bit like a geography lesson because there are a huge number of countries in West Africa. So they cut out swifts and each chose a colour of the flag that they wanted to. And we got a bit of a shock actually because we then had a grocery box with about 200 swifts that we had to pin back on the display. But anyway, we think it was worthwhile and we were very pleased to do it. Now, this tag that we put on the swifts, the geolocator, it's not like a satellite tag that cuckoos wear. I don't know if any of you have been following the movement of cuckoos through the British Trust of Ornithology, but they record in real time. So you can see at any time where the cuckoo is, for example, whether it might be over Spain or whether it might have reached its wintering grounds in Senegal. But the swift isn't big enough to carry a device like that. So in other words, we have to download the data when the swift returns the following year. So that's the route and the wintering area. But what about this non-stop flight? Swift actually is the record breaker of the avian world for non-stop flight. And the reason we know this is with a type of geolocator that's called an accelerometer. And it was first of all done on this bird, the Alpine Swift, which migrates to Europe and is a little larger than the swift. But with increased miniaturization, it's now being done on the common swift as well. And so what was found, if you look here, is that the blue throughout the year, the wintering period, shows that the bird was on the move all the time. This device records movement every few seconds. So it was only static and only landed in this yellow period here, which is the 3 months when the swift is breeding. All for the rest of the year, it was on the move. So swifts surely have reached the record books. And I have to say that I think the real record breaker is the chicks, because they're doing this for up to 4 years at a time. Now, what about the timing of our swifts? Well, as I said, they arrive in early May. By the end of May, they've usually laid eggs. 20 days to hatching, which is around the middle of June. And the chicks spend quite a long time in the nest, 40 days, and are going to fledge around the end of July. And this is quite a long period in the nest compared with birds of a similar size. So the stage we're at the moment is around here. In other words, the parent birds are feeding the chicks in the nest. There are no chicks flying in the sky. So if you look up and you see a much larger number than usual, perhaps, of swifts, They're not chicks. It's just that more swifts you happen to be seeing that particular day. So chicks fledge at the end of July, and our earliest chicks, and this is the stage, as I said, that our birds are, when they finally fledge, about our earliest ones will be the 23rd of July. They will join the skies of the adult swifts flying around, and they depart in early August. This might be this part of the world around the 7th of August, something like that. So actually, when the chick leaves the nest, it's only got a week to 10 days or so to fly around, get the knack of flying before it embarks on that first migration back to Africa. It really is a pretty amazing feat. Now, it's probably worth saying, just pointing out, because people easily get confused with swallows and martins. They do look very similar in aerial flight, or they are totally unrelated to swift. A quick way is when they're flying is you can see these white patches on the house martin and swallow. And as they twist and turn in the sky, if you catch a sight of a bit of white, then it means it's not a swift. And furthermore, a bird on a wire is never a swift because they can't perch. But importantly, there's big differences in nesting. These are swallows typically nesting in a barn or a porch or a garage on a beam, and you can see the chicks in the nest. And a house martin builds a nest outside the house, tucked up under the eaves, these mudge-shaped nests, and you can see the chicks on the nest again. And actually, they're both really rather messy, aren't they? But still wonderful birds to have around. But swifts are different. Swifts are totally dependent, with very few exceptions actually, on buildings for nest sites. They've evolved over thousands of years to do this, and you never see a swift on the nest. This is a typical nesting place. There were 22 pairs of nests in this in Greyrig Church, and this house as well, swifts under the eaves. And what actually happens is, what a swift is doing, it's flying into a little crevice in the eaves. Swifts dart into the eaves. You never see them on the nest. Blink and you miss them. So that's the big difference with swallows and martins. And what they're doing, as you can see from this arrow here, is that they're darting into a little crevice, nest on top of the wall. They don't go into the building. What perfect house guests there are. Only 3 months of the year, they don't make any mess, not like swallows and martins, and they don't do any damage to the building at all. And this is a clip just to show what a tiny crevice a swift can fly into between the cladding of that building. A lot of the early research for swifts was done in the Museum of Natural History in Oxford. They nest in these ventilation flutes here. And after decades of watching them, David Lack found the most important thing was that once a pair of swifts has bred, they are 100% faithful to that nest site, returning to the exact same site year after year. But the chicks, once they fledge, they don't come back to that same nest site, and we don't actually know how far afield they go. Sadly, swifts are in serious decline in the UK, and this rate of decline shown here on this graph is 57% over the last 2 decades. Now, swifts are currently amber listed. Why aren't they red listed, which is the most endangered? The reason is that the criterion for red listing is that you have to have a 50% decline over 25 years. And as you can see, that is a greater rate of decline than is required. But we haven't got records for swift for more than 23 years. So probably what's going to happen is that we have to wait for the next review in a year or so's time for swift, sadly, to go onto the red list. And the current rate of decline we now estimate as 62%. That's 2/3 of our swift population lost in about 25 years. And at this rate, we're in danger of losing our swifts altogether. This is our cottage overlooking the Howgill Fells and the River Lune, a good place for foraging. It's an unusual location because we think of swifts as urban birds because they're dependent on buildings for nest sites. And so we're probably, our colony here, which is actually stands at 30 pairs now, is the remnants of an even bigger colony here. But from the heather, you'll get insects flying up, and swifts can fly, you know, any distance to get food. So they may well be going over to Falshore Moss, the Cumbria Wildlife Trust Reserve, nice and marshy, lots of insects there. You know, it's no problem for swifts to cover any distance to find plenty of food. Now, what do swift nest sites look like? We had to re-roof, which is when we put the cameras in the nest sites. So when the slates are removed in an old building, this is the outer wall, that's the inner wall, and in between is filled with rubble. So if you look over to the right-hand side here, that is an original swift nest that we found when the slates were taken off. So the swift on these tiny little feet would fly under the gutter, crawl up on those tiny legs up into that nest space and bring up its chicks in that very confined space. So what we were doing was taking out the rubble between each and every rafter all the way around the house to make quite palatial accommodation for our swifts. And this is the back wall of the house, showing that the swifts don't go in there. And usually that would be your loft. But in our case, it was actually our bathroom. So we could have just plastered and boarded it up and had done with it. But as I said, we wanted to get cameras in. So what we did was that we had little doors made, custom made double glazed unit behind, so that we can actually get access to our swifts inside, to the cameras inside. We never open these doors when the swifts are there. But otherwise, it's a completely normal bathroom. But it is quite magical at night to hear the chicks and the swifts chittering away, only inches, in fact, from your face. The whole lot is wired up to TV. So May to July, you know, daytime TV, that's us watching. But it's also connected to a very high memory DVR, so that we can actually go out during those 3 months and we can download clips of activity, which is what I'm going to be showing you. And this is one of the reasons, so that I could show you these clips, that I think we have had difficulty with the transition of the system that we're using for this talk today. This is a pair of swifts in one of our nest sites. The male and female are identical, but you can see these long scythe-shaped wings that enable the swift to spend its life in the air. All the clips that I'll show you from our nests are black and white, because these are infrared cameras. It's completely dark in this nest site. They're back. This is the first day, beginning of May, that this swift has arrived back in its nest site. And we all get very excited. Messages around the country between enthusiasts, they're back. It hasn't landed for 9 months. The first time it's come back to its nest site that it hasn't seen for 9 months. And it settles down and waits patiently for its partner. And here it is, they're flying in together. These two birds haven't seen each other for 9 months. They migrate separately, they spend the winter separately, and yet they come back to the exact same nest site. And after 20 years of studying our swifts, it never fails to amaze us that they come back to the exact same site year after year after year. A couple of years ago, we were lucky enough to catch them mating. Now, they do mate in the air. I must say, we've never actually seen that happen. So clearly, they can mate both in the air and actually in the nest site. This is a swift bringing in some nest material. And it's quite a big beakful, I could say, probably the biggest we've ever seen. Looks like bits of heather. They can only catch aerial debris floating around in the air. They're particularly fond of feathers, bits of heather, bits of dried grass. And we put in the nest site one of these concaves, because quite often they don't build their nests, build the nest until they've actually laid their eggs. And so it's to help prevent the eggs rolling away. And here are some nests to show you. They lay 2 or sometimes 3 white eggs, and this is a particularly nicely made nest by an established pair. Here's another one. This is one of ours this year with 3 eggs. But sometimes, if you look at this pair, again, this is one of our pairs this year, they laid 2 eggs with absolutely no nest material at all. They have actually now just started building the nest. So you can see why we need to put these little nest platforms in. Incidentally, they only have 1 brood. So in that 3 months is just 1 brood. And if they only laid 2 eggs, that shows what a low rate actually of reproduction the swifts are, shows how vulnerable they are. I'm going to show you a series of pictures that Edmund took with a camera through the little doors when the parents were out, which is why these are in colour. This is some two-day-old chicks in one of our nests when they'd laid 3 eggs. And here the chicks are about 16 days old. The feathers are in what we call pin. They're emerging from the sheaths. And by 20 days here, this lower picture, you can see that they really are beginning to look quite swift-like. And the majority of our swifts have now reached this stage in our colony. Now, as the swift flies around in the air, it catches insects. And here's one of ours. And as it catches the insects, it stores them in its throat, which distends into this bulge, which it's then going to bring in to disgorge into its chicks to feed them. And in fact, a swift, when it's busy feeding its chick, can eat up to 20,000 insects a day. This is green fly, mosquitoes, midges, aphids, and tiny aerial spiders that live very high in the atmosphere as well. So they're pretty good birds to have around. Now, as I said, swifts can fly great distances to feed, but they don't need to if they've got a good source nearby. This is Lough Neagh in Northern Ireland. And in this case, GPS trackers were fitted onto the birds. Because of the battery, they don't last very long, but it's very good for showing foraging. So the first swift here at Mark's house in Antrim, I'll show you where the swift foraged. So in other words, this big loch, it concentrated on the area near its nest. At the second site, at the bottom of Lough Neagh, which is here, this swift foraged at that end of Lough Neagh. So it makes common sense, isn't it? You don't go further than you need to. And the swifts that were in Belfast, over on the right-hand side, when they came to Lough Neagh, they just made a beeline straight for the loch and fed in the nearest area. Sorry, I advanced too much. I want to show you now a clip of our swifts feeding their chicks. And when they first emerge, there's actually a bit of a docking problem, as you can see. It's completely dark in this nest site. So it's actually quite amazing that all 3 of them actually get fed. Now here we've got the swift coming in again, see its bulge. And what I want you to watch is the throat of this swift. It's disgorging the insects into its throat, and where my pointer is, can you see that dark bulge as the insects are forced into the throat of the swift, into the chick? And this one never ceases to amaze me. 11-day-old chick, and can you see it there where my pointer is? The adult, instead of giving it little morsels, has put the whole plateful all in one go, and that swift is valiantly trying to swallow the insects. Now here we've got swifts which are getting ready for fledging time, almost fully grown. They're the same weight as the adult by this stage. In fact, they often have to lose weight in the final days. But the big difference here is their wings. They are not full length, and it's probably the wing length to body weight ratio that determines when the swifts are ready to fledge. This is a picture again that Edmund took through the doors. It's a lovely picture of a young swift within a week of fledging. And the young swift, they tend to have a whiter face and these white edges to the primary feathers. It's a lovely picture, that one. Now, this is nighttime of 2 parents and 3 adult chicks. Parents always come into the nest site at night, which is why we often do a lot of our searching for swift nest sites in the hour before dusk. So you can see it gets pretty crowded in that nest. Think about the real nest when it was so cramped under the tiles. Now, in fact, that is 3 fully grown chicks and 2 parents. But can you see that there is actually an egg there? One of those chicks is not actually having hatched from the parents. And at this time of year particularly, we start getting rung up. People have found fallen chicks that have fallen out of the nest. And what can you do about it? Well, a few years ago, we started with other people pioneering fostering. So if we have got through our cameras chicks of a similar age to the fallen chick, we pop it into the nest site, and swifts can't count, birds can't count. So in other words, we put it in and the parents happily feed the 3 chicks instead of the 2 that they had before. And it's an absolutely ideal way of continuing the growth of that chick. Otherwise, it's really a very specialised rehabilitation. There are people that can feed the chicks, but it's a very specialised technique. We're not very good at it. There are a few experts around the country, but not enough to cope with all the fallen chicks. It's a very specialised technique. They have a diet. They have to have crickets and waxworms, and they're very difficult to feed. One of the most amusing activities to see of the swifts is press-ups. When they're about 3 weeks old, they start exercising their wings, and you can see they're pressing down. What they're doing is strengthening these pectoral muscles, these shoulder muscles, ready for that first maiden flight when it leaves the nest. They lift the whole body up in the air. And this next one is, I might have advanced it too quickly. Let me go back. Is doing the most amazing backflips. I mean, I think if any of us could do exercises like that, we'd be pretty pleased. It's to strengthen these wing muscles ready for that flight. And this one is almost doing head over heels, if you can say that. Really, really quite spectacular activities, these press-ups. We've now got a chick that is ready to fledge. It sits at the entrance hole, ready to make that crucial maiden flight. It's never flown before. It's getting ready to go. It's actually nighttime. You can see through the hole. Parents totally unconcerned, because once this chick fledges, there it goes. It does not return to the nest, nor is it fed by its parents. It is completely independent of its parents. It has to feed, drink, and fly completely on its own. So that maiden flight, that crucial maiden flight is really vital for that bird, which is why they did, all those press-ups. And it really is extraordinary for that bird to be completely independent. And as I said, in maybe only 10 days' time, embarking on a migration to Africa. Now, I said our swifts are in trouble, that huge decline, 2/3 of the population, and we strongly believe it's loss of nest sites, because they tend to nest in older buildings. As houses get renovated and old houses get demolished, the entrance holes get blocked up or we lose them. Here's an example. This house had open eaves here that the swifts nested in. Some rather tatty soffits were put up, and the swifts would come back the next year and try and fly in, and they can't. And it's distressing to see them trying to get in, because they're 100% faithful to that nest site. And so potentially you're losing another breeding pair. This is the problem for swifts. A scaffolded house. Now, if that scaffolding, there were swifts that nested in this house. Now, if this was done in the breeding season, this actually would be a criminal offence, because it is a criminal offence to interfere with breeding birds. but it isn't. There is no protection for birds outside the breeding season. And this type of work doesn't need planning permission, so there is nothing to stop the owner mortaring up all the entrance holes to the swift, and then you're going to lose yet more swifts. And we seem to be obsessed as a nation with putting soffits up, closing up every crevice, which really isn't necessary, because this is right up in the eaves which should actually have ventilation. It's perfectly possible to renovate a house and leave the tiny crevice that the swift nests in. Because the problem is that modern buildings offer no nesting opportunity. Smooth walls, almost hermetically sealed, no nooks and crannies and crevices for the swift to nest in. Our cities increasingly look like this, plenty of glass, nowhere for swifts to nest. Demolitions here, buildings with swifts that are going to be demolished to make way for housing. Here, this old mill, we were quite lucky with this one. It was due to be demolished and rebuilt, the top floor, and we got a planning condition from the local authority that when it was rebuilt, they put in swift nest bricks. So that was quite a successful story. So our swifts are in trouble. What we're trying to do is get everybody, developers, builders, people, us, to think swift. What can we do? Well, around the country, there's well over probably 100 different swift groups now, all trying to do what I'm talking to you about this evening, that swifts need our help. Our group is Sedbergh Community Swifts here, but there are many swift groups around the country with threefold aim. We want to retain the existing nesting places, and to do that, you've got to find out where they are. So a lot of our time is spent surveying for nest sites so that we can help people look after them, and also encouraging people to put up nest boxes. And this is what we've done in Sedbergh, for example. These are the major places where swifts nest. Put up boxes. This is the Simpson Box, which is the one we tend to recommend because it's robust and it's inexpensive. Currently about £18 with including the nest concave. And John Simpson, who makes them, has made 27,000 of these Simpson boxes. So I think he's hoping to do 30,000 before he retires. Peak Boxes also make some very nice boxes, quite a lot more expensive. If you really want to attract swifts to a new location, the best thing to a silver bullet that you can do is to play swift calls. Swifts are colonial breeders, and the existing swifts will scream out of their holes. And what they're trying to do is attract other swifts that are flying around outside, those screaming parties that I showed you at the beginning, to come and join them, find some nearby crevices. So by playing swift calls through a little amplifier like this is the best way to try and get swifts to come and nest in your box. It needs plugging in, but it's a very simple little system, and a chap we know in Kendal is selling the whole caboodle for only less than £20. What's that? A couple of drinks when you're out. So it really is the best way to get them to come to your nest box if you haven't got any nearby. Here's some boxes put up in Sedbergh. 2 of those 4 boxes are occupied. They always need to be put up at the highest point of any building. Here's another couple, but it doesn't have to be a tall building like this. Any 2-storey modern house is perfectly okay for swift boxes. About 3 meters is the minimum. Even better than boxes are internal nest bricks. It's a completely hollow unit with the right size hole here. Terribly easy to install when buildings are being constructed. Time of construction, so easy to put them in. And this is the gable in our cottage, and you can see there's a couple of these. We took the stones out, so we retrofitted them in. In fact, we've got 6 of those in, all occupied in the first year. Swifts love the internal bricks. There's a couple of swifts peering out of their nest brick in our gable. And the latest swift brick to be designed is absolutely brilliant. It's called the S brick. And you can see here, the reason it's so good, it was designed to be of the dimensions of a UK brick. If you're going to get builders or developers to put these into their buildings, you don't want them to have to think. You want a brickie to come along and put brick, 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 in goes a Swift brick, 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 without any measurement or thinking. And the great thing is as well, is that the dimensions are such that they can fit into the outer cladding of stone cladding that we have in many of our buildings in Cumbria. And this is just to show a neighbour of ours on their extension has just had those S bricks put in. And I think you'll agree they look pretty good, don't they? Another possibility, and this is our gable again, can you see these 12 smaller holes here? This is the entrance piece in close-up. And what the system is, it's called the Cambridge system, is that you have this little outer piece here. Through the wall, you have a 4-inch drain pipe. And on the inside, in your loft, you've got a wooden nest box. And this is no more difficult than putting in, an extractor fan for your bathroom, for example. So we fitted 12 of these into our gable, and currently 8 of them are occupied. And we've got cameras in those boxes as well, which is what I've been showing you. I'm going to show you now from the outside of the house, swifts flying into these holes. This is hugely slowed up because swifts fly at full pelt to the hole, fold their wings and dart in very quickly. Now these birds that you can see aren't going in. They're clinging on to the stonework. They're what we call the bangers because sometimes they hit the woodwork and you can hear them actually bang. And what they are is these are swifts that are not yet old enough to breed, and they are practicing their technique for landing at holes. They're attracted by the screams of the existing breeding swifts, and they're practicing the idea for future years of landing in holes for when they come back to breed in another year. I said swifts aren't messy, and look at this. They eat the droppings of the chicks. Whenever I give a talk to children, they love watching this bit. So the chicks' droppings are eaten by the parents, and the adults do their droppings outside, which is why it's another brilliant reason for having swifts as your house guests. Some projects that we did, it's important to do this not just in houses, but public buildings. This was an extension to our community hall in Sedbergh, and you can see 4 nest bricks incorporated, playing swift calls, all 4 occupied, overlooks the children's playground and recreation field. So isn't that wonderful that people can see them going in? Another very successful project was at the secondary school in Sedbergh, where we put up nest boxes at a few locations around the school. And what was exciting is that the 2 boxes that went up in this location here were occupied in the first year, which is pretty good going because swifts aren't like blue tits that they will, occupy a nest box as soon as you put it up. You often have to have a lot more patience than that. So what we did over the winter was that we took the swift boxes down, we replaced them with identical boxes, but with webcams in. So now, through the wonders of the internet, there can be a live feed down into school reception, and the wonders of the internet, people can stream and watch that activity. There's a couple of swifts in that Sedbergh Swifts webcam, really lovely quality. And those 2 swifts are still breeding, and I've got footage of them as we speak. Church belfries are another really good place to encourage swifts to nest. This is St Mary's in Ely, and in the belfry here, in the bell tower, have been built special swift boxes, and there are now 50 pairs in St Mary's. So can you imagine when they all get going? So this week, Swift Awareness Week, I'm sure they will be having an event outside where people can just marvel at all these swifts flying around. Because obviously louvers in all churches are different, you're talking about custom-made boxes here. So you need a DIY enthusiast, somebody with carpentry skills to fit the boxes. And this is St Andrew's in Sedbergh, where we've also done it. Sadly, we haven't got any takers yet, but our local vet is a brilliant carpenter, and he made the boxes with Edmund that we installed in the tower. Very important to get youngsters interested in all of this, isn't it? and we visited a number of primary schools. Here we have Greyrig, which was our, I showed you earlier, where we had a morning with the children, lots of activities. We've written a book for them that they can keep all about Swifts. We do a Swift quiz, and this shows you two pupils who are preparing one of the nest concaves that we stuck little feathers in to help the Swifts. To show that these nest bricks really do work, this was done many years ago at Fulbourn in Cambridge, where this block of flats was no longer fit for purpose and going to be demolished. But it had one of the biggest Swift colonies in the country of about 80 pairs. So by arrangement with Action for Swifts and the local ecologists and the local planning authority, the demolition of the flats was phased while these new houses were built, and they were built all with Swift bricks in them. And the result was that from 2009, when it had about 72 breeding pairs, it's now beyond that in the bricks in the new houses, with the internal bricks being used. So it really does demonstrate that Swift bricks are a brilliant way of increasing Swift breeding. Public buildings are important. There's Exeter Library has got Swift bricks in. Antrim Library here has got 15 bricks, all occupied. A bit nearer home, K Village in Kendal, a planning condition was obtained for Swift bricks when it's renovated to put in that facade there, and so we'd hope that Swifts will take over there as well. We all know that Prince Charles is very keen on the environment and wildlife, and the Duchy of Cornwall is building 2 massive estates at Ansledden and Tregonwell Hill. And what they are doing, and have done already, is build in Swift bricks into all those houses at the fantastic ratio of 1:1. And even better, they are monitoring those as well. A system has been set up to monitor them. And Prince Charles has now said that all properties in the Duchy, wherever they are, will all have Swift bricks. This is what we like to hear, and follow his example. Barratt Homes in Kingsbrook in Buckinghamshire is also putting Swift bricks in, much lower ratio, I have to say, because what we're trying to do with developers is to say people are becoming much more aware now of the environment. So there's often green spaces, maybe pools of water, planting more bushes and flowering shrubs to encourage bees, and making hedgehog highways. But the message that we are giving is that buildings are habitat as well. It's the crucial habitat for Swifts, but also there are other cavity nesting birds as well that would use it. So buildings are also our habitat. And this is really a terrifically overlooked aspect of the environment and biodiversity. Ribble Valley is doing really well. Housing Association putting up internal Swift boxes and in the council offices. And this is what we need to encourage. So what can we do, all of us here this evening? The reason you're here is that because you are passionate about the environment and wildlife. And for many endangered species, say like snow leopard or the blue whale, more or less all we can do is perhaps send a check off to the campaign to help support whatever action is being done. But with Swifts, it's different. They share our habitat, our homes, our workplace, our buildings. So actually it's in our hands to do something for Swifts. What we need to do is put up nest boxes and bricks, including in public buildings. And importantly, we have got to get planners, architects, developers on board, and the ecologists who write the reports for the developers. I'm sure as you drive around, how many big housing estates do you see? They're all, like I showed you, those new developments, you know, smooth, no crevices at all. How many Swift bricks could you get in there? It's an incredibly inexpensive thing to do. They don't cost much, and they're so easy to install at the time of construction. And I don't know why it's such an uphill battle for us to get the developers on board. But if we're to give Swifts a future, this is what we have to do. And so all of us can volunteer to help survey for nest sites, collect the information. You can be put in touch with us, and it can all be sent to the Biodiversity Records Centre. Everything help. Set up a new Swift group. Think Swift. This has to be our message. And I think of all the Swift Awareness Weeks, which this actually isn't, but this is the most fantastic ceremony. This is in Jerusalem, the Western Wall, all that remains of the Holy Temple, where people come to pray. And it's the most southern known nesting site in the world. And there are over 80 pairs of swifts nesting here. And what happens is when the swifts come back, which is earlier than the rest of Europe, they come back in March here. This is the Mayor of Jerusalem. And they have a welcoming ceremony to welcome back these wonderful birds that spend their life in the air. So there is journalists, there is radio, there's television, there's visitors. And we had the privilege of being there 2 years ago at the International Swift Conference. So smaller versions of this can be done in Swift Awareness Week. They really are wonderful birds. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I will leave you with this clip of a couple of swifts in one of our nest sites. And I can only apologise for the technology and the difficulties we had. Hope we haven't kept you longer than you intended and you've been able to follow so far. Thank you.
Question section, a few people have asked us some questions.
Right, okay. So once again, I am sorry. Right, so I'm just looking for some questions. I've got a question. Let me see. Can nesting and fledging times vary around the UK? Yes, they vary. They will vary within an area. So it's not just necessarily that the South get them first and Scotland gets them later, although that probably is a trend. It isn't just that. There is great variation. For example, our earliest swifts came back on the 5th of May. They've got the oldest chicks, and I had some that didn't come back until the beginning of June. So there is quite a bit of variation. Now, there was another question, but let me go back to it. Did the swifts arrive much later this year? And if so, will they leave later? Well, many people thought that a lot of swifts did arrive later this year. May was absolutely the most terrible weather, if you remember. It was cold and wet and windy, and we really did fear for our swift population. And we did have some pairs that arrived very late. So yes, if they arrive late, they will lay their eggs late, they will hatch late, and they will leave later. And in fact, we think that our latest breeding pair could well be here into the first week of September. We certainly will be seeing some beyond the usual departure time of the first week of August. I think we will see them for another couple of weeks after that. But one thing that you have to remember is, and I should have said this earlier, when you see the swifts flying around in the sky, feeding, when they're high, and you may be over a park or something, and you see maybe 30 swifts flying around, they're feeding. And at this time of year, they will be a mixture of the breeding birds, but also those youngsters that aren't old enough to breed, the non-breeders. There will be both types of bird that are flying around, not the chicks yet. So the non-breeders have only got themselves to look after. So come the beginning of August, or maybe even the end of July, they will disappear. They can migrate sooner. They haven't got any chicks to look after. So once it's only the late breeding birds, there may appear to be far less around. But yes, they could leave later, some of them. So if I scroll down for another question. Thank you. How do we volunteer for Swift counting? Well, if you are inspired by what I've said today, start with a pal going out in your area where it's convenient. If you live in a village, or if you're, say, in Carlisle, in a part of town with Swifts, just start going around maybe the hour before dusk. At the moment, you can do it in the mornings because the Swifts are busy feeding. And it's just a question of wandering around and keeping your eyes up on the eaves. And when I meet somebody in town, even though I'm talking to them, I'm actually looking up because I don't want to miss a trick of Swifts. And gradually you get a feeling for your area. And if you're standing there looking at a house and somebody's inside the house and they wonder what you're doing, don't feel shy. You hope that they're going to come out, and then you can talk to them and tell them what you're doing. And so the word spreads. And basically, Sedbergh Community Swifts just started off with Edmund and me, but gradually people joined us. And so you set your records up. I always go out with a notebook and pencil because you have to do a quick sketch of where you see them, front eaves, back eaves, the address and whatever. And eventually you can set it up as a little spreadsheet. But there's also a national organisation, the Swiftness local network, that we can put you in touch with. But basically, if you wanted to get in touch with Cumbria Wildlife Trust, I'm sure they would pass your details to me, and I could email you and we could take this forward. I would be very happy to do that. Now, so that's volunteering, which I hope all of you will. Okay. The sound quality's gone very bad. Where are we? In a wildlife hospital book, it said to throw grounded birds in the air. No, they're wrong. Okay, we always find people who give incorrect information. So sadly, they are wrong. With Swifts, don't throw it in the air. It's possible, of course, the Swift is injured and it can't fly. And we did have this once, that the Swift tried to take off and it just plummeted to the ground. So we had to take it for further advice, and sadly it had broken its pectoral girdle. So don't throw them in the air. Sadly, that place was wrong. And it's surprising, people do, people do make mistakes, but hopefully you'll be able to correct them. I think I've skipped a dozen questions earlier in the talk. Well, I'll deal with the ones I can see now, and then I'll go back. There's two questions here. What are the best aspects for the nest, and which side of the building is it best to put up the boxes? Well, basically, it doesn't matter, north, south, east, west. Traditionally, we'd probably do north facing or west facing, perhaps best to avoid the prevailing wind. But it was shown in the Oxford Tower that north, south, east, west doesn't really matter. What I would say, you don't want any obstruction in front, like a big tree or wires directly in front. But all things being equal, where are you going to watch your Swifts? If you sit in the garden in the evenings, then put the boxes at the back of your house, somewhere where you're going to actually see them. That's the best advice I can give. And about at least 3 meters in height. Modern houses, perfect, all right. A friend of ours lives in a modern box-like house, and he's got 29 pairs of Swifts in boxes all the way around his house. Not quite beaten me yet. We've got 30 pairs. Okay, shall I scroll down? We have a couple of pairs which enter our attic, which is open as a new house. Should we consider putting up internal box partitions or just leave open? I would think that some partitioning would be a good idea here because, well, for many reasons, it's better to contain them. They don't need containing. The chicks could get lost. The eggs could get lost. I think this is somewhere where we would absolutely be able to offer specialist advice, because if some of you want to Google two Swift websites, two organisations. One is called Swift Conservation, and the other one that would help very much here is called Action for Swifts. And we know these people extremely well. And Action for Swifts are great at designing situations such as this. So again, I see that question has come from Peter Chiverton. If you would like to be put in touch with me, I'm happy for my email to be passed on. I can give you some advice on that. Okay, Doug has said, link to the RSPB Swift Mapper. Yes, this is, the RSPB has designed a new Swift Mapper this year, which is extremely easy to use. And this is where you can put any nest site or screaming parties as well that you actually see. And it's very easy to enter the details on there. Basically, what we need, though, is these records to go to planning authorities. And it's not entirely clear with RSPB Swift Mapper how that is going to happen, because for an applicant for the planning authority to receive those details, they would need to come off Swift Mapper to go to biodiversity centres. But Doug has put a link there, so I don't know if anybody else can see that, or again, it can be passed around. It's very easy to use, Swift Mapper. I mean, I keep my records because our records go directly to the planning authority where they will be useful actually for the planners. Question here from Chris. Last year, the Swifts seemed to persist 2 weeks after the screaming party ceased. Would they be local birds or birds from other area? The screaming parties, which incidentally we nicknamed the Bovril Boys because they remind us of bikers hurtling around on their motorbikes. The screaming parties probably, we reckon, are a social activity, and they're probably a mixture of breeders and non-breeders. So the breeders are bringing in the non-breeders to the areas where their colonies are. So they will probably stop. We still got screaming parties actually, and what are we, halfway through July? But the screaming parties will stop, and of course the non-breeders will have disappeared. So the Swifts that are left after that probably will be local birds. Of course, you will always get, once passage starts, you will get birds flying over from other areas, but they will tend to be quite high when they're actually on their southerly passage for migration. Somebody has just said how Action for Swifts is great. Now, what I'm going to do now is go right back up to the chats, because apparently I missed some questions. No, it's all talked about the technical issues, so we want to get past that, don't we? We want to get past all that. I'm just scrolling through. It sounds as if some of you couldn't hear me very well. I'm sorry about that. I could normally, when I give a talk, raise my voice. Sorry, I'm scrolling through all these technical issues, looking for a question in case I've missed any. Somebody talking about the recording. Ah, right. Okay, I've found a question. Do the Swifts get inside the church? We occasionally find them in ours. Normally they wouldn't, because the Swift, as I said, doesn't actually want to go in the building. If this is your wall, it just wants to nest in a crevice on the wall plate. I suppose if it was completely open within the church, they could. I would expect, did they fall in the church? Did they fall to the ground? Did they fly around? Did they find a way out? I'm sure that would be unusual. How did they get in from the nest site, or did they fly in through some open doors? I'm not sure I can help you too much with that. But normally they wouldn't go in, as they wouldn't go into a building, into anybody's house. If you have insulation in your loft, does this deter the swifts from nesting? Well, if you're talking about insulation can be a problem actually, but if you're talking about insulation between your joists, the swift isn't going to get that far. The swift essentially is just in your eaves, in sort of on top of your wall. So it shouldn't actually be a problem. It's a bit like just a bit further in than your soffit, if you did have a soffit. And I'll digress here, because if you have got soffits, one way of creating a nest box is to cut a hole in the soffit. And what some people have done is even partition off the soffits, but with holes in. That's an extremely simple way of having nest boxes. Next question. Do you clean out the nest chambers in the winter, and what action do you take against flat flies? No, we don't clean out the nest chambers. Well, the ones that we have access to, I will get the little hoover out and I will sweep it out. But the majority of our colony, because we've got 30 pairs in natural nests and in the other places as well, we can't clean them out. They're not accessible. And what happens is the contents of the nest box, it's dry in there, it just desiccates. And of course, natural nest sites aren't being cleaned out at all. And remember, the adult swifts are eating quite a lot of the droppings. So it isn't actually a problem. You mentioned flat flies. Now, I didn't talk about flat flies. They apparently are not meant to harm the swifts, although it's difficult to imagine that they don't, quite frankly, because they are feeding on the blood of the swifts. But again, we are very fortunate is that we haven't been troubled by flat flies. The name is actually Craterina. Only 1 year did we have a problem, so we haven't had to do anything about it. I think possibly the answer is, well, that's nature. But if we did have a lot of Craterina 1 year, we would, if it was a nest site we had access to, we would clean it out, I have to say. Okay, another question. Where do we get the disc-shaped preformed nests? Presumably by that you mean what we call the concave, or the nest cup that fits inside the nest box. Okay, we have got quite a stack of them at the moment, which we can supply if you're given my email. There will be a link on Action for Swifts to John Simpson, who makes the box, and he also makes the concaves. So I'm sure he would supply the concaves himself if you wanted. He deals by post. He's actually near Ely, but you know, everything can be done by post. But actually, the latest design for that nest cup, and if you're handy, you could do it yourself. I'm holding up my hand here, but it's a piece of ply in which a circle is cut and the hole is taken out. So it's not a special concave anymore. It's just a platform with a hole through to the bottom of the box. And we actually think that that's better. That's the sort we've got. And it's just high enough to stop the eggs rolling away. The ones I've got at the moment, I think, are 12 mils high. And I think they could do with being higher, possibly as much as 20 mils with a hole in the middle. So if you've got anybody that's handy, that's a very easy way to do it. Otherwise, get in touch with me. And
I was just going to say, I think we'll have to wrap up soon. So do you want to answer maybe one last question?
Well, I think I've got back to the questions where I started, so that's perfect.
Okay, good timing.
I can only apologise for all the difficulties at the beginning. I think it was beyond both my and Helen's control, sadly.
Okay, well, thank you very much for persisting tonight, Tanya. That was a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.